Hegel, Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Section 1, Logic, the science of the idea in and for itself, Billahil that, Walillahi Jama'a, Chapter 9, third subdivision of logic, the doctrine of the notion, quasi subdivision C, the idea, infra subsection C, the absolute idea. Encyclopedia section 236. The idea as unity of the subjective and objective idea is the notion of the idea, a notion whose object, Gegenstand, is the idea as such, and for which the object, Objekt, is idea, an object which embraces all characteristics in its unity. This unity is consequently I, the absolute and all truth, the idea which thinks itself, and here at least as a thinking or logical idea. The absolute idea is, in the first place, the unity of the theoretical and practical idea, and thus, at the same time, the unity of the idea of life with the idea of cognition. In cognition, we had the idea in a biased, one sided shape. The process of cognition has issued in the overthrow of this bias and the restoration of that unity, which as unity and in its immediacy is in the first instance the idea of life. The defect of life lies in its being only the idea implicit or natural, whereas cognition is an equally one sided way, the merely conscious idea or the idea for itself. The unity and truth of these two is the absolute idea, which is both in itself and for itself. Hitherto we have had the idea in development through its various grades as our object, but now the idea comes to be its own object. This is the
Noises noiseos. Sense of understanding.
which Aristotle long ago termed the supreme form of the idea. And that was translate.google.com. Encyclopedia section 237, seeing that there is in it no transition or presupposition, and in general no specific character other than what is fluid and transparent, the absolute idea is for itself the pure form of the notion, which contemplates its content as its own self. It is its own content insofar as it ideally distinguishes itself from itself, and the one of the two things distinguished is a self identity in which, however, is contained the totality of the form as the system of terms describing its content. This content is the system of logic. All that is at this stage left as form for the idea is the method of this content, the specific consciousness of the value and currency of the moment in its development. To speak of the absolute idea may suggest the conception that we are at length reaching the right thing in the sum of the whole matter. It is certainly possible to indulge in a vast amount of senseless declamation about the idea absolute, but its true content is only the whole system of which we have had hitherto studying the development. It may also be said in this strain that the absolute idea is the universal, but the universal not merely as an abstract form to which the particular content is a stranger, but as the absolute form into which all the categories, the whole fullness of the content it has given being to, have retired. The absolute idea may in this respect be compared to the old man who utters the same creed as the child, but for whom it is pregnant with the significance of a lifetime. Even if the child understands the truths of religion, he cannot but imagine them to be something outside of which lies the whole of life and the whole of the world. The same may be said to be the case with human life as a whole and the occurrences which the same may be said to be the case with human life as a whole and the occurrences with which it is fraught. All work is directed only to the aim or end, and when it is attained, people are surprised to find nothing else but just the very thing which they had wished for. The interest lies in the whole movement. When a man traces up the steps of his life, the end may appear to him very restricted, but in it the whole decursus vitae is comprehended. So too the content of the absolute idea is the whole breadth of ground which has passed under our view up to this point. Last of all comes the discovery that the whole evolution is what constitutes the content and the interest. It is indeed the prerogative of the philosopher to see that everything, which taken apart is narrow and restricted, receives its value by its connection with the whole, and by forming an organic element of the idea. Thus, it is that we have had the content already. And what we have now is the knowledge that the content is the living development of the idea. This simple retrospect is contained in the form of the idea. Each of the stages hitherto reviewed is an image of the absolute, but at first in a limited mode, and thus it is forced onwards to the whole, the evolution of which is what we termed method. Encyclopedia section 238. The several steps or stages of the speculative method are, first of all, step or stage A, the beginning, which is being or immediacy, self subsistent, for the simple reason that it is the beginning, but looked at from the speculative idea, being is its self specializing act, which, as the absolute negativity or movement of the notion, makes a judgment and puts itself as its own negative. Being, which to the beginning as beginning seems mere abstract affirmation, is thus rather negation, dependency, derivation, and presupposition. But it is the notion of which being is the negation, and the notion is completely self identical in its otherness, and is the certainty of itself. Being, therefore, is the notion implicit before it has been explicitly put as a notion. This being, therefore, as the still unspecified notion, a notion that is only implicitly or immediately specified, is equally describable as the universal. When it means immediate being, the beginning is taken from sensation and perception. The initial stage in the analytical method of finite cognition, when its When it means universality, it is in the beginning of the synthetic method. So when it means immediate being, Allahu Dhat, the beginning is taken from sensation and perception, the initial stage in the analytical method of finite cognition. When it means universality, Allah, uh, Allah Jama'a, it is the beginning of the synthetic method. But since the logical idea is as much a universal as it is in being, since it is presupposed by the notion as much as it itself immediately is, its beginning is a synthetical as well as an analytical beginning. Philosophical method is analytical as well as synthetical, not indeed in the sense of a bare juxtaposition or mere alternating employment of these two methods of finite cognition, but rather in such a way that it holds them merged in itself, in every one of its movements. Therefore, it displays an attitude at once analytical and synthetical. Philosophical thought proceeds analytically insofar as it only accepts its object, the idea, and while allowing it its own way, is only, as it were, an onlooker at its movement and development. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive. Philosophic thought, however, is equally synthetic and evinces itself to be the action of the notion itself. To that end, however, there is required an effort to keep back the incessant impertinence of our own fancies and private opinions. Encyclopedia section 239, step or stage B. The advance renders explicit the judgment implicit in the idea. The immediate universal, as the notion implicit, is the dialectical force which, on its own part, deposes its immediacy and universality to the level of a mere stage or moment. Thus is put the negative of the beginning. Its specific character, it supposes a correlative, a relation of different terms, the stage of reflection. Seeing that the immanent dialect only states explicitly what was involved in the immediate notion, this advance is analytical. But seeing that in this notion this distinction was not yet stated, it is equally synthetical. In the advance of the idea, the beginning exhibits itself as what it is implicitly. It is seen to be mediated and derivative, and neither to have proper being nor proper immediacy. It is only for the consciousness, which is itself immediate, that nature forms the commencement or immediacy, and that spirit appears as what is mediated by nature. The truth is that nature is the creation of spirit, and it is spirit itself which gives itself a presupposition in nature. Encyclopedia section 240. The abstract form of the advance is, in being, an other and transition into an other, in essence showing or reflection in the opposite, in notion, the distinction of individual from universality, which continues itself as such into, and is as an identity with, what is distinguished from it. Encyclopedia section 241. In the second sphere, the primarily implicit notion has come as far as shining, and thus is already the idea in germ. The development of the sphere becomes a regress into the first, just as the development of the first is a transition into the second. It is only by means of this double movement that the difference first gets its due when each of the two members distinguished, observed on its own part, completes itself to the totality, and in this way works out its unity with the other. It is only by both merging their one sidedness on their own part that their unity is kept from becoming one sided. Encyclopedia section 242. The second sphere develops and the second sphere develops the relation of the difference to what it primarily is, to the contradiction in its own nature. The contradiction which is seen in the infinite progress is resolved, step or stage C, into the end or terminus, where the difference is explicitly stated as what it is in notion. The end is the negative of the first, and as the identity with that is the negativity of itself, it is consequently the unity in which both of these firsts, the immediate and the real first, are made constituent stages in thought, merged and at the same time preserved in the unity. The notion, which from its implicitness thus comes by means of its differentiation, and the merging of that differentiation to close with itself, is the realized notion, the notion which contains the relativity or dependence of its special features in its own independence. It is the idea which, as absolutely first, in method, regards this terminus as merely the disappearance of the show or semblance, which made the beginning appear immediate and made itself seem a result. It is the knowledge that the idea is the one systematic whole. Encyclopedia section 243. It thus appears that the method is not an extraneous form, but the soul and notion of the content, from which it is only distinguished, so far as the dynamic elements of the notion, even on their own part, come in their own specific character to appear as the totality of the notion. This specific character, or the content, leads itself with the form back to the idea, and thus the idea is presented as a systematic totality, which is only one idea, of which the several elements are each implicitly the idea, whilst they equally by the dialectic of the notion produce the simple independence of the idea. The science, in this manner, concludes by apprehending the notion of itself as of the pure idea for which the idea is. Encyclopedia section 24, Encyclopedia section 244, the very last. The idea, which is independent or for itself, when viewed on the point of this its unity with itself, is perception or intuition, and the percipient idea is nature. But as intuition, the idea is, through an external reflection, invested with the one sided characteristic of immediacy, or of negation. Enjoying, however, an absolute liberty, the idea does not merely pass over into life, or as finite cognition allow life to show in it. In its own absolute truth, it resolves to let the moment of its particularity, or of the first characterization, and other being, the immediate idea, as its reflected image, go forth freely as nature. We have now returned to the notion of the idea with which we began. This return to the beginning is also an advance. We began with being, abstract being, where we now, and we also have the idea as being. But this idea, which has being, is nature.